The warning sounds filled every corner of the Galactic Council station, and Ambassador Velcor of the Zenthari Empire felt his 3 eyes grow wide as he stared at the holographic display before him, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. Because the quarantine barrier around the human world called Earth was breaking apart, and this was something that should not have been possible for another 5,000 years at least, and he stood there frozen and unable to move as he watched the impossible become real right before his eyes. High Counselor Threxis appeared next to him in a flash of light, and her crystalline body pulsed with energy that showed her panic and fear, even though she tried to hide it, and she spoke in a voice that trembled just slightly, and said that the barrier was not breaking down on its own, but rather the humans were taking it apart from the inside, and they had somehow learned to control quantum fields, which was technology that should have been far beyond their reach for centuries to come. All across the galaxy, every species that could travel between the stars received the same alert at the same moment, and they all felt the same cold fear creep into their hearts, because the humans were finally breaking free. And these were the same creatures who had fought terrible wars on their own planet, and who had created weapons that could destroy entire continents, and who lived on a world so dangerous that most other species would die there within hours, and now they were coming out into the wider galaxy, and no one knew what would happen next. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earthship called Pathfinder, and he watched as the last pieces of the barrier turned to dust and disappeared into the darkness of space. And he was a tall man with gray hair starting to show at his temples, and he had spent his whole life getting ready for this moment. And now that it was here, he felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders, because he knew that what happened next would change everything for humanity and for the galaxy itself. Lieutenant Amy Carter sat at the navigation station, and her fingers moved quickly across the controls as she checked and rechecked their readings. And then she looked up at Jake and reported that the barrier was completely gone, and they now had a clear path to the nearest jump point that would take them out into council space, and her voice was steady. But Jake could hear the excitement underneath it, because this was what they had all been waiting for, and training for, and hoping for. Jake nodded slowly and told Amy to send a message back to Earth Command, and to tell them that humanity was no longer trapped behind the barrier, and that it was time to go out and meet their neighbors among the stars. And as he gave the order, he wondered what those neighbors would be like, and whether they would welcome humanity or fear them, or perhaps both at the same time. What Jake and the rest of humanity did not know was that their neighbors had been watching them for a very long time, and that every war they had fought, and every weapon they had built, and every sign of their drive to survive and grow stronger had been carefully recorded and studied, and the Galactic Council had not put the barrier around Earth to protect humanity, but rather to protect everyone else from humanity, because they had seen what humans were capable of, and they were terrified. The humans had evolved on a world that the Council classified as a Class 12 deathworld, which meant it was one of the most dangerous planets known to support intelligent life, and the gravity there was crushing, and the temperatures swung wildly, from extreme heat to extreme cold, and the diseases and bacteria were aggressive and deadly, and the predators were so dangerous that they would be considered military weapons on most other worlds. And yet humans had not just survived in this environment, but had thrived and grown strong. The Council had watched as humans developed nuclear weapons before they even reached their own moon, and they had seen humans fight wars with chemical and biological weapons that would have wiped out entire populations of other species, and they had observed how human children played games about war and combat, and how human entertainment was filled with violence and conflict and competition. And all of this had led the Council to one conclusion, which was that humans were too dangerous to be allowed to spread through the galaxy. So they had built the barrier, and they had told themselves that it was for the good of everyone and that they were preventing a catastrophe, and they had locked humanity away like dangerous animals in a cage, and they had hoped that maybe over time the humans would become less violent and less aggressive, but instead the humans had only grown stronger and smarter and more capable. And now, after 2,000 years, they had broken free, and there was nothing the Council could do to stop them. Velcor turned to Threxis and asked what they should do now, and Threxis was quiet for a long moment as she thought about their options, and finally she said that they needed to make contact with the humans before they reached any populated systems, and that they needed to try to establish some kind of diplomatic relationship. Even though she knew that many on the Council would oppose this idea, because they would want to try to force the humans back into quarantine, or perhaps even destroy them before they could become a threat. But Threxus also knew that neither of those options was really possible anymore, because the humans had shown that they could break through the barrier, which meant their technology was far more advanced than the Council had believed, and any attempt to attack them might end very badly for the Council. And besides that, she had a feeling that maybe the Council had been wrong about the humans and that perhaps they deserved a chance to prove themselves. The Pathfinder continued on its course toward the jump point, and Jake stood in his ready room looking at the star charts and the small amount of information that humanity had managed to gather about the galaxy beyond their prison, and it was not much because the barrier had been very effective at keeping information out, as well as keeping humans in, and he wondered what they would find out there, and whether the other species would be friendly or hostile. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Hayes entered the room carrying a datapad, and she was a capable officer in her 30s, who had a reputation for being brilliant at tactics and for staying calm under pressure. And she told Jake that they were detecting multiple ships on an intercept course and that the ships were not military vessels, but they were heavily shielded, and they were hailing the Pathfinder on multiple frequencies. Jake asked how many ships there were, and Lisa told him there were 7 ships and each one appeared to be from a different species based on their different hull designs, and Jake felt his pulse quicken, because this was it, and this was the moment. A first contact and everything that came after would depend on how this meeting went. He straightened his uniform and told Lisa to put the transmission through, and the view screen activated, and suddenly, Jake was looking at 7 different alien faces, and each one was stranger than the last, and some had multiple eyes, and some had no eyes at all, and some looked like they were made of crystal or energy or living metal, and the one who spoke first appeared to be the leader, and she introduced herself as High Counselor Threxus of the Galactic Council. Threxus said that they came in peace and that they wanted to welcome humanity to the wider galaxy, and her voice was calm and measured. But Jake had spent years learning to read people, and he could see the tension in the way the aliens held themselves, and the way some of them would not quite meet his eyes, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. Jake introduced himself as Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth vessel Pathfinder, and he said that humanity was honored to finally meet other intelligent life. But then he asked the question that was burning in his mind, and he asked why it had taken 2,000 years and the collapse of a barrier for this meeting to happen, and the silence that followed his question told him everything he needed to know, because these aliens had known about humanity all along, and they had deliberately kept them locked away, and now he needed to find out why. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within just a few hours after the barrier around Earth had fallen, and representatives from 47 different species filled the great chamber, and their voices were raised in heated argument, as some called for immediate military action against the humans, while others suggested they should try diplomatic talks first, and most of them simply radiated pure fear, because they had all heard the stories about what humans were capable of doing. High Counselor Threxus demanded order in a voice that rang through the chamber like a bell, and her crystalline form pulsed with authority, as she told everyone to be quiet and to listen, because they had always known this day would eventually come, and now the only question that mattered was how they would respond to the situation they found themselves in. Ambassador Velcor stepped forward and proposed that they send a diplomatic delegation to intercept the human vessel before it could reach any populated systems, and that they needed to establish communication with the humans as quickly as possible, and that they needed to try to make them understand the rules and laws that govern civilized space. Representative Quilnar of the Sophine Collective asked what they were supposed to tell the humans, and his translucent body shimmered with anxiety as he pointed out that they would have to explain that they had been keeping humanity imprisoned for 2,000 years, and that they had classified Earth as a biological hazard zone, not because of disease, but because they were afraid of what humans might do if they were allowed to spread through the galaxy. The chamber fell completely silent because this was the question that no one wanted to answer, and no one wanted to admit out loud that they had kept an entire species locked away simply because they were scared, and now they would have to face the consequences of that decision. Meanwhile, the Pathfinder continued its journey toward the nearest inhabited system, and Jake stood in his ready room, reviewing every piece of information that humanity had managed to gather about the galaxy, and it was frustratingly little because The quarantine had been remarkably effective at keeping information out as well as keeping humans locked in. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Hayes entered with a datapad in her hands, and she told Jake that they were detecting multiple vessels on an intercept course and that the ships were not military configurations, but they were heavily shielded, which suggested they were important diplomatic vessels, and she added that they were hailing the Pathfinder on multiple frequencies. Jake asked how many ships there were, and Lisa told him there were 7 ships with each one representing a different species based on their hull designs. And Jake knew this was the moment everything would change, and he told Lisa to put the transmission through because it was time to meet their neighbors. The view screen came to life and showed not just one alien face, but 7 different ones, and each was stranger than anything Jake had ever imagined. And the one who spoke first was the crystalline being who called herself High Counselor Threxus of the Galactic Council, and she said they came in peace to welcome humanity to the wider galaxy. Jake studied the faces on the screen, and he noted the tension in their body language, and the way some of them could not quite meet his eyes. And he introduced himself, and said that humanity was honored to finally meet other intelligent life. But then he asked why it had taken 2,000 years and a barrier collapse for this meeting to happen, and the silence that followed told him everything. The diplomatic meeting was arranged to take place aboard a neutral station called Harmony Point, which was a massive structure built at the crossroads of several major trade routes, and Jake brought with him a small delegation including Lisa Hayes as his first officer and Dr. Paul Chen, who was a xenobiologist, and Commander Helen Brooks, who was chief of security. The council chamber was designed to accommodate dozens of different species with varying environmental needs, but what struck Jake most was the heavy security presence with armed guards and force fields, and what appeared to be heavy weapons emplacements, and all of them were pointed inward toward where the human delegation would sit. Helen muttered quietly that the aliens were really afraid of them, and her hand instinctively moved toward her sidearm. But Jake shot her a warning look, because the last thing they needed right now was to appear aggressive or threatening. High Counselor. Threxus floated at the center of the chamber with Ambassador Velcor and the other representatives arrayed around her, and she said that they owed humanity an explanation for what had been done, and Jake replied that an explanation would be very much appreciated while keeping his voice carefully neutral. What followed was a history lesson that changed everything humanity thought they knew about their place in the universe, and Threxus explained that 2,000 years ago, the Galactic Council had been expanding through their spiral arm of the galaxy when they discovered Earth. The initial observations had been promising because they found a species on the verge of spaceflight and showing clear signs of advanced civilization and technological development. But deeper analysis had revealed something that terrified the council members who studied the data. Humanity's evolutionary path was unlike anything they had ever encountered before in all their thousands of years of exploring the galaxy, and Earth was classified as a Class 12 deathworld, which meant it was among the most hostile environments known to support intelligent life anywhere. The humans had evolved not just to survive but to thrive on a planet with crushing gravity that would cripple most other species, and with extreme temperature variations that swung from burning heat to freezing cold, and with aggressive microbiology that could kill in hours, and with predators that would be classified as weapons of war on most other worlds. Velcor explained that humanity had fought wars using chemical weapons and biological agents and atomic fire, and that they had split the atom and turned it into a weapon of mass destruction before they had even managed to reach their own moon, and that their entertainment consisted of simulated combat and violence, and that even their children played games about warfare and conflict. He said that human civilization appeared to be built entirely on conflict and competition and conquest, and that this was completely unlike how other species had developed, and that most species learned to cooperate and work together long before they developed dangerous technology. Dr. Paul Chen leaned forward and pointed out that what Velcor was describing was simply natural selection and survival of the fittest, and that this was just how evolution worked on their world. Velcor replied that what seemed natural to humans was absolute horror to everyone else in the galaxy, and that most species developed in cooperative environments where working together was the key to survival rather than competing and fighting, and that humanity weaponized everything they touched. He said the council had calculated that if left unchecked, humanity would either destroy itself in a final terrible war, or it would begin a campaign of expansion that would threaten the entire galaxy, and that every model they ran showed humanity as a potential extinction-level threat to civilized space. Jake said quietly that so they had locked humanity away like dangerous animals in a zoo, and Threxis dimmed her glow and admitted that yes, they had done exactly that, and that they were not proud of this decision, but the alternative had been to allow what they believed was a threat to spread through civilized space, and they had chosen what seemed like the lesser evil at the time. Lisa stood up abruptly and said that they had no right to make that decision and that they had judged humanity based on fear and speculation rather than on who they actually were, and that humans had been fighting to better themselves and to overcome their violent past, and that they had maintained world peace for over a century. Quilnar interrupted and pointed out that this peace had been maintained under the protection of a barrier that prevented humans from encountering external threats, and that peace in a cage was not true peace, and he asked how humans would react when they encountered species who competed with them for resources, or when they faced real threats to their survival, and whether they would default to the violence that had brought them to the top of their food chain on Earth. The chamber fell silent as everyone waited for the human response, and Jake looked at each council member in turn, and he could see the fear in their eyes and the way some of them sat poised to flee at the first sign of aggression from the human delegation. Finally, Jake spoke and said that he understood their fear, and that humanity's history was indeed violent and that they would not deny this fact. But he said the council had made a fundamental error in their assessment because they had judged humanity by their worst moments while completely ignoring their greatest achievements. He said that yes, humans had created terrible weapons, but they had also created art and music and literature and philosophy, and that they had split the atom and made bombs, but they had also built power plants and medical devices that saved billions of lives, and that humans were not just survivors but also dreamers and explorers and sometimes warriors, but also capable of compassion and sacrifice and change. Jake stood and several guards tensed visibly, and he said that the council wanted to know how humans would react to external threats, and that the answer was simple because they would react the same way they had always reacted to. The months following humanity's introduction to the Galactic Council were anything but smooth and peaceful, and Earth immediately began establishing diplomatic relations and trade agreements and cultural exchanges with dozens of different species across the galaxy, and human technology, particularly in the fields of materials science and heavy industry, proved to be remarkably advanced, which was a direct result of having developed on a high-gravity death world where everything had to be stronger and more durable. But beneath the surface of these diplomatic efforts, tensions were simmering and growing stronger with each passing week, and there were those in the galaxy who did not want humans to succeed and who were actively working to prove that the Council's original fears about humanity had been correct all along. Commander Helen Brooks found herself sitting in a security briefing aboard the New Earth Embassy station, which orbited near the Council headquarters, and with her was Admiral Peter Grant, who had been newly appointed as Earth's military liaison to the Council, and Ambassador Karen Foster, who was a career diplomat chosen to represent humanity's interests in Council space. Helen pulled up a holographic display and told them they had a serious problem, because there had been multiple incidents of violence against human civilians in Council space, and she listed 3 merchant vessels that had been boarded and their crews brutally assaulted, and 2 human diplomats who had been poisoned with compounds specifically designed to be lethal to human biology, and 5 separate attempts to sabotage human ships with explosives and computer viruses. Admiral Grant's jaw tightened, and he asked who was behind these attacks and whether they had identified any patterns or organizations responsible for the violence against human personnel, and whether there was a coordinated effort or just random acts of hatred. Helen said that was the real issue because the attacks were coming from multiple different sources, and some appeared to be random acts of xenophobia from individuals or small groups who hated and feared humans, but others were coordinated and professional operations that suggested military or intelligence training and planning. She said someone was trying to prove the Council's fears correct, and trying to demonstrate that humans did not belong in civilized space, and that they were too dangerous and violent to be allowed to integrate with the rest of the galaxy. Ambassador Karen Foster sighed and said, or alternatively, someone was trying to provoke humanity into responding with violence because if humans retaliated militarily against these attacks, then it would confirm everything that had been said about them being aggressive and warlike and unable to control their violent impulses. Helen's frustration was evident in her voice as she asked what they were supposed to do, and whether they should just take these attacks and do nothing while human citizens were being hurt and killed, and whether they were supposed to turn the other cheek and prove they were peaceful by allowing themselves to be victims. Karen replied firmly that no, they would not just take it, but they would respond in a way that no one expected them to, and that they would investigate these attacks and pursue justice through proper legal channels and protect their people without escalating to open warfare, and that they would show the galaxy that humanity had evolved past their violent reputation. Meanwhile, on the Pathfinder, Jake and Lisa were dealing with a different kind of problem, because they had been assigned to joint patrol duty with a Zenthari warship called the Stormwing, and this was the first military cooperation between human and alien forces, and the Zenthari captain named Velmir had made no secret of his distrust and dislike of humans. During a joint briefing session, Velmir commented that human weapons were primitive by Zenthari standards, and that kinetic projectiles and explosive warheads were crude tools that his people had abandoned thousands of years ago in favor of more elegant and advanced energy weapons. Lisa bristled at the insult, but Jake placed a calming hand on her arm and said that different did not mean primitive, and that human weapons had evolved to be reliable and effective in Earth's harsh conditions, and that they worked in any environment, and required minimal maintenance and could be produced quickly using common materials, and that there was real value in that kind of reliability. Before Velmir could respond with another insult, the sensors detected an anomaly, and the Zenthari sensor operator reported that an unknown vessel was emerging from subspace, and that its configuration matched known profiles of Krovan raiders. The Krovan were pirates and outcasts from several different species, who preyed on shipping lanes throughout Council space, and they had been a persistent problem for decades, but their hit-and-run tactics made them extremely difficult to catch and bring to justice. Lisa checked her own sensors and reported that the raiders were targeting a civilian transport vessel with Sophene registry that was carrying medical supplies to a remote colony world that desperately needed them. Velmir hesitated and said that standard protocol was to call for reinforcements because Krovan vessels were heavily armed, and they typically traveled in packs of 3 or more ships, and engaging them without support was considered extremely dangerous. Jake said that the transport did not have time to wait for reinforcements to arrive, and that people would die if they did not act immediately, and he told the Pathfinder crew to set an intercept course at maximum speed, and that they were going in whether the Zenthari came with them or not. The 2 ships raced toward the transport as 3 Krovan raiders closed in on their helpless prey, and the pirates clearly had not expected any military intervention to arrive this quickly, and they definitely had not expected to encounter humans who they knew very little about. The Pathfinder's approach was completely unorthodox compared to standard Council military tactics, and instead of the elegant energy-efficient maneuvers that most galactic vessels used, it moved with raw power and aggression, and its heavy fusion drives pushed it to velocities that made Velmir's crew extremely nervous, because they were exceeding what most species considered safe acceleration limits. Velmir warned over the communication channel that the human vessel was exceeding safe acceleration limits and that they needed to reduce speed before their crew was injured by the extreme forces, but Jake replied calmly that these limits were safe for Zenthari perhaps, but not a concern for humans who had evolved in much higher gravity. He told his crew to prepare for high-gravity maneuvers and activated the enhanced inertial compensators that had been specifically designed for human physiology, and then the Pathfinder did something that made Velmir's crew stare in disbelief at their sensors. What followed was a brutal lesson in human combat doctrine and tactics, and the Pathfinder did not waste any time with warning shots or attempts at communication with the raiders, because Jake knew that every second of delay put the civilian transport and its crew in greater danger. The human ship came in fast and hard, and its mass drivers sent depleted uranium rounds screaming through space at a significant fraction of light speed, and the projectiles punched straight through the shields of the nearest Krovan ship because those shields had been designed to deflect energy weapons, not physical projectiles moving at relativistic velocities. The Krovan ship's hull was torn open and it began venting atmosphere and debris and spinning out of control as its crew scrambled to reach escape pods before their ship broke apart completely. The second raider tried to flee when it saw what had happened to its companion, but Lisa had anticipated this move, and she had already calculated the most likely escape vectors, and she cut off its path with a series of precisely aimed shots that disabled its engines without destroying the ship entirely. The third raider, seeing both of its companions neutralized in a matter of seconds, immediately broadcast a surrender signal and powered down its weapons because its captain was smart enough to know when he was completely outmatched. Velmir stared at his tactical displays in shock and disbelief, and finally managed to say that the human combat performance had been unexpectedly effective, and that he had never seen raiders defeated so quickly and decisively. Jake allowed himself a slight smile and said that yes, their weapons might be crude tools by Zinthari standards, but they certainly got the job done when it mattered, and that sometimes the old ways were the best ways, especially when dealing with pirates who did not expect to face physical projectile weapons. The rescue operation that followed was a major turning point in how many species viewed humanity, and news spread quickly through council space about the humans who had saved a civilian transport without any hesitation and using tactics that were brutal and direct, but undeniably effective. Some species viewed the incident with admiration and began to see humans as potential allies who could be counted on in a crisis, while others saw it as confirmation of human aggression and violence, and warned that this was exactly the kind of behavior they had feared. But no one in the galaxy could deny one simple fact anymore, and that was when the shooting started and lives were on the line, you definitely wanted humans on your side because they did not hesitate, and they did not waste time with elaborate protocols, and they got results. The Safine, whose transport had been saved, sent an official message of gratitude to Earth and to Captain Morrison personally, and they requested that human ships be allowed to patrol their trade routes because they felt. The attacks against human civilians continued to escalate over the following weeks, and what had started as isolated incidents had grown into a coordinated campaign of violence and intimidation, and Commander Helen Brooks found herself working around the clock to investigate the attacks and protect human personnel throughout council space. She discovered that many of the attacks were being funded and organized by a shadowy group that called itself the Purity Coalition, and its members came from several different species who all shared one common belief, which was that humans were a contamination that needed to be removed from the galaxy before they could spread their violence and chaos to other worlds. The Purity Coalition had cells operating in dozens of systems, and they were recruiting members by spreading propaganda about human atrocities and by claiming that the Council had betrayed all civilized species by allowing humanity to join, and that action needed to be taken before it was too late. Admiral Grant convened an emergency meeting with his top officers and Ambassador Karen Foster, and he said that the situation was reaching a critical point because the attacks were becoming bolder and more deadly, and eventually there would be an incident that humanity could not ignore or respond to peacefully. Karen agreed and said that the Purity Coalition wanted exactly that outcome because they wanted humans to retaliate with violence, so they could point to it as proof that humanity was too dangerous and should be expelled from council space or worse. She said they needed to find a way to stop the attacks without giving the coalition what they wanted and without confirming the fears that many species still held about human aggression and violence. Helen proposed that they conduct a covert operation to infiltrate the Purity Coalition and gather intelligence about their leadership and operations, and then present that evidence to the Council so that official action could be taken through legal channels. Admiral Grant considered this and finally nodded his approval, and said that Helen would lead a small team of specialists who would go undercover and infiltrate the coalition and gather the evidence they needed. But they would have to be extremely careful because if they were discovered, it could start an interstellar incident. Meanwhile, on the Pathfinder, Jake and Lisa were dealing with a different crisis because they had been dispatched to respond to a distress call from a remote mining colony on the edge of council space, and when they arrived, they found the colony under attack by unknown vessels. The attacking ships were using weapons and tactics that did not match any known pirate groups, and their assault on the colony was methodical and professional, rather than the usual chaotic raids that pirates conducted. Jake ordered his crew to battle stations, and the Pathfinder moved to engage the attackers. But as they got closer, Lisa detected something that made her blood run cold, because the attacking ships had military-grade shields and weapons that should not have been available to any non-council forces. She reported this to Jake and said that these were not pirates but rather a professional military unit, and that someone had sent them to attack this colony for reasons that were not yet clear. Jake opened a channel to the attacking vessels and demanded that they stand down and identify themselves, but the only response was a burst of weapons fire that barely missed the Pathfinder and made it clear that they had no interest in talking. The battle that followed was intense and brutal, and the attacking ships were well-trained and well-equipped, but they had not expected to face a human vessel, and they quickly learned that human combat doctrine was unlike anything they had encountered before. The Pathfinder moved with aggressive speed and used its physical projectile weapons to punch through shields that were designed to stop energy weapons, and within minutes 2 of the attacking vessels were disabled and drifting, while the other 3 decided that retreat was a better option than continuing the fight. Jake ordered his crew to pursue the fleeing vessels, but they jumped to hyperspace before the Pathfinder could catch them, and disappeared into the void, leaving behind only debris and the 2 disabled ships. Lisa led a boarding party to secure the disabled vessels and search them for clues about who had sent them and what they were after. And what she found was deeply disturbing, because the ships were registered to shell companies that traced back to legitimate businesses in council space. The crews of the disabled ships refused to talk and claimed they were just following orders. But the ship logs and communication records told a different story, and they revealed that the attack had been ordered by someone high up in the Purity Coalition, and that the mining colony had been targeted because it had several human workers. Jake immediately sent a report to Admiral Grant with all the evidence they had gathered, and he said that this changed everything because they now had proof that the Purity Coalition was not just a terrorist organization, but had access to military resources and support from within council space itself. Admiral Grant took the evidence directly to High Counselor Threxus and demanded that the council take immediate action against the Purity Coalition and prosecute everyone involved in the attacks on human civilians and the assault on the mining colony. Threxus studied the evidence, and her crystalline form dimmed with what appeared to be shame and sadness, because the evidence showed that several council member species had individuals in their governments and militaries who were supporting the coalition, either directly or indirectly. She promised Grant that the council would investigate thoroughly and take action. But she also warned him that this would be a delicate process, because they could not afford to destabilize the council itself, and that some species might react badly to accusations that their people were involved in terrorism. Grant said he understood the political difficulties, but that human patience was running thin, and that his people wanted to see justice done, and that if the council could not or would not act, then humanity might be forced to take matters into their own hands. Threxus replied that she hoped it would not come to that, because if humans acted outside council authority, it would give the Purity Coalition exactly what they wanted, which was an excuse to portray humanity as lawless and dangerous. The situation continued to deteriorate as more attacks occurred, and human casualties mounted, and back on Earth, the government was under increasing pressure from its citizens to do something more aggressive to protect their people in space. Commander Helen Brooks and her team successfully infiltrated a Purity Coalition cell and began gathering intelligence about their operations and leadership structure, and what they discovered was even worse than they had feared. The coalition had support from several powerful individuals, including some council representatives and military officers and corporate leaders, and they had been planning a major operation that would result in massive casualties and be designed to force a confrontation between humanity and the rest of the council. Helen transmitted this intelligence back to Admiral Grant, along with a warning that the major operation was scheduled to occur within the next 2 weeks, but they did not yet know the specific target or timing. Grant immediately increased security around all human facilities and personnel, and he ordered all Earth ships to maintain high alert status and to be prepared for anything. But despite all these precautions, he knew they could not protect everything, and that the coalition would find a weakness to exploit. Ambassador Karen Foster worked frantically to build political support within the council for stronger action against the coalition, and she met with dozens of representatives trying to convince them that the coalition was a threat, not just to humanity, but to the stability of the entire council. Some representatives were sympathetic and agreed to support stronger measures, but others were reluctant to act because they feared the political consequences, or because they secretly agreed with the coalition's goals, even if they did not approve of their methods. Dr. Paul Chen received a strange message from an anonymous source who claimed to have information about the coalition's planned operation and who wanted to meet in secret to discuss it, and Chen immediately reported this to Admiral Grant, who ordered Helen Brooks to provide security for the meeting. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of the embassy station, and the anonymous source turned out to be a Zenthari intelligence officer who said his name was Corvan and that he had become aware of the Coalition's plans through his work. Corvan explained that the Coalition was planning to attack the upcoming Unity Festival, which was a major celebration where representatives from all Council species gathered to commemorate the founding of the Council, and that thousands of beings would be present, including many humans. He said the Coalition planned to detonate several large explosives during the festival, and then blame the attack on human extremists, and use it as justification for expelling humanity from the Council, and possibly even military action against Earth itself. Helen asked why Corvan was revealing this information and risking his own career and possibly his life, and he replied that he had studied humanity carefully and had come to believe that the Council's fears were based on misunderstanding and prejudice rather than fact. He said he had seen how humans responded to crises and how they protected the weak and stood up for justice, and he believed that humanity deserved a chance to prove themselves, and that the final crisis came exactly 6 months after humanity's emergence from quarantine, and it came from a direction that no one had expected because the Krellian Empire, which was a powerful but reclusive species from the galactic core, had been watching humanity's integration with growing concern and alarm. The Krellians were an ancient race that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and their technology was so advanced that it made the councils look primitive by comparison. And they had long ago sworn off expansion and conquest because they believed in isolation and non-interference in the affairs of younger species. But humanity's presence had changed their calculations, and they had decided that the Council had made a catastrophic mistake by allowing humans into civilized space, and that this error needed to be corrected immediately before it led to disaster. High Counselor Threxus received the message directly from the Krellian Emperor himself, and the message was brief and terrifyingly clear because it demanded humanity's immediate return to quarantine and stated that if the Council refused, then the Krellian Empire would enforce the quarantine themselves, and they gave the Council exactly 48 hours to comply with their demands. An emergency session of the Council convened within the hour, and the chamber was in absolute chaos, as species argued furiously about what they should do, and some believed the Krellians were bluffing and would not actually attack, while others knew better because when the Krellians made threats, they always followed through on them. The debate raged for hours as representatives shouted over each other, and some demanded that humanity be immediately returned to Earth and the barrier rebuilt, while others argued that surrendering to threats would destroy the Council's credibility and authority. Ambassador Karen Foster stood before the Council with her expression calm, despite the turmoil swirling around her, and she asked the Council members to consider what compliance with the Krellian demands would mean. She said it would mean admitting that might makes right, and that the strong could dictate terms to the weak, and that any species with enough military power could impose their will on everyone else. And she asked if that was the kind of precedent the Council wanted to set for the future. Representative Quilnar responded angrily that it was easy for her to talk about principles when humans were not the ones who would face the Krellian fleet, and that his people and many others would be caught in the crossfire if war broke out. Karen acknowledged his point and said he was absolutely right that humans would not be the only ones to suffer if the Krellians attacked, but she also said that if the Krellians did attack, they would be attacking humanity first and foremost, and that this was humanity's fight more than anyone else's. She said humanity would not ask other species to die defending them, and that if it came to war, then human ships would stand alone against the Krellian fleet and face whatever came without expecting help from the Council. Ambassador Velcor shook his head and said that was suicide because the Krellian Empire had weapons that could sterilize entire worlds and turn them into lifeless rocks, and humanity had been in space for less than a year, and he asked what humans could possibly do against such overwhelming power. Karen smiled grimly and said that humans would do what they always did when faced with impossible odds, and that they would survive and adapt and fight with everything they had, because that was in their nature, and they had never learned how to give up even when they should. Earth's response to the Krellian ultimatum was swift and dramatic, because every available warship was immediately mobilized, and the Pathfinder along with 20 other vessels formed a defensive line at the edge of Council space between the Krellians and the inhabited systems. It was not an impressive fleet by galactic standards, because humanity's space navy was still in its infancy, and most of their ships were converted civilian vessels with weapons hastily installed. But it was every ship they had, and every crew was ready to fight. Jake stood on the bridge of the Pathfinder watching the countdown timer that showed less than 30 minutes until the Krellian deadline would expire, and they had refused to back down or retreat despite knowing they were completely outmatched. Lieutenant Amy Carter reported that they were receiving a transmission from Admiral Grant, and that he was broadcasting to the entire human fleet, and Jake told her to put it through so everyone could hear what the Admiral had to say. Admiral Grant's face appeared on every screen throughout the fleet, and he did not waste time with pleasantries or false hope, but instead spoke plainly about what they were facing. He said they were outgunned and outmatched and outsized, and that the Krellians had every advantage except one, which was that they had not fought a real war in 10,000 years, while humans had been fighting since they learned to walk upright. He said the Krellians thought they could intimidate humanity into submission, and that they thought humans would run when faced with superior force, but they did not understand that humans do not run when cornered, but instead, they fight harder. Grant said that today they were not just defending humanity but defending the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, had the right to decide who deserved to exist and who did not, and that if the Krellians wanted to send humanity back to their cage, they would have to go through every human ship first. He told all ships to go to battle stations and to prepare for combat, and he said it was time to show the galaxy what humans were really made of, and what they were capable of when pushed to their absolute limit. The Krellian fleet emerged from hyperspace exactly on schedule, and it was a sight that would have made any sane military commander immediately surrender, because there were 50 massive warships, and each one was larger than any human vessel, and their hulls gleamed with advanced armor that could probably withstand anything humanity could throw at them. The human fleet looked like children's toys in comparison, and several crews reported that their sensor readings were showing power levels from the Krellian ships that seemed impossible. But then something unexpected happened that changed everything, because ships began emerging from hyperspace behind the human defensive line, and they were not Krellian ships but rather vessels from dozens of Council species. Synthari warships appeared first, followed by Sophene carriers, and then ships from species that had previously been neutral or even opposed to humanity, and one by one vessels from across the Council took up positions alongside the human fleet. Ambassador Velkor's voice came over the open communication channel that all ships were monitoring, and he said that the Council had made its decision and that they would not abandon humanity to face this threat alone. He said the Krellian Empire would have to go through all of them if they wanted to attack humanity, and that the Council stood united in defending the right of every species to exist free from intimidation and threats. The lead Krellian vessel opened a communication channel, and its commander was a being of such ancient power that looking at it made even hardened veterans uncomfortable, because it seemed to exist partially outside normal space. The Krellian commander spoke with a voice that resonated with authority built up over countless millennia, and said that the Council was making a grave mistake, and that humanity was dangerous and would eventually destroy everything the Council had built over thousands of years. High Counselor Threxus responded personally, and her crystalline form blazed with light as she said that maybe the Krellians were right, and maybe humanity would eventually cause problems, but that it was the Council's choice to make, and not something to be dictated by outside threats. She said humanity was now under official Council protection, and that if the Krellians attacked humans they would be attacking the entire Council, and that this would mean war between the Krellian Empire and every species represented in Council space. The standoff continued for hours, with both fleets facing each other across the void of space and weapons charged, and shields raised to maximum power, and the entire galaxy held its breath, waiting to see if this would be the day that everything changed forever. Communications were happening behind the scenes between Council leadership and Krellian command, and diplomatic channels were working frantically to find some way to resolve the crisis without bloodshed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Krellian fleet began to power down their weapons, and their commander sent one final message saying that they would withdraw for now, but that they would be watching humanity very carefully. The Krellians did not leave because they feared defeat in battle, because everyone knew they probably could have won if they had really wanted to fight, and their technology was simply too advanced for the Council to overcome. They left because they realized that the Council was genuinely willing to fight and to suffer massive casualties defending humanity, and that the old order where powerful empires could simply dictate terms to weaker species was ending, aboard the Pathfinder. Jake let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like hours, and Lisa leaned back in her chair with relief visible on her face, and she said that they had just faced down the most powerful empire in the known galaxy. Jake corrected her and said that no, they had not faced down the empire alone, but rather they had allies who stood with them and who were willing to fight beside them, and that made all the difference in the universe.